remember the time that I had one of my biggest God moments of my life. It was when I was in the 5th grade. I had been living a life of sexual abuse, neglect, trauma, and I hadn't told anybody outside of my family what was going on. I hadn't even told my mom what was happening. And I was at school, and I had found out that some of the kids that I went to school with on Wednesdays went to religious education. And as I was listening to them, I was thinking, hey, this might be a good opportunity or excuse not to have to go home after school, because I had purposely missed the bus a few times and I was getting in trouble. So here I saw this opportunity not to learn about God, but to possibly have an excuse to not have to go home after school. So my mom registered me for classes, and as a 5th grader I had to go back into 1st grader, the classroom. I was the biggest kid in there, but I didn't care because I didn't have to go home. And as I was preparing for my very first confession and my very first communion, 2 really great things happened. The first one was I was smarting off to the nun that was teaching the class, and I had said something, and she had said, you know what, Christina, don't you want to be with God forever in heaven? And I, as smart aleck comment, said, who knows how long forever is anyways? And she said, well, if you took the biggest beach in the world and you could possibly count every single grain of sand on that beach, and if you could multiply that number by the biggest number that you could ever think of, forever in heaven is longer than that. And I remember my mind being blown in that moment. This concept of something huge and bigger than myself for the first time kind of awakened something in me, this desire to know who God was and to think that maybe this was actually something worth knowing about. And as I proceeded to prepare for my first confession, it was a sunny afternoon, and as I walked into this old church, it was one of these old country churches where they had these big mahogany doors where you walk right from the outside to inside. And since it was the afternoon, there's no lights on, so it was dark. My eyes took a moment to adjust, and I walked over, got in line with the other persons going for first confession. And as I went into that room, it was one of those side doors, you know, the old time where you go in and you put your knees down on the board and the light turns on and the priest opens up the screen. It was the first time in my whole life of the last several years of abuse that I ever felt safe enough to tell somebody about what I was going through. So I wasn't confessing it because it was my sin or something that was wrong. It was more about in the sacrament of confession, and they do talk about it as being a doctor for your soul. I felt that I was in a place where I could unload this huge emotional burden I was carrying. And as I shared with the priest what was going on in my home, and of course he wasn't able to do anything about that because it was in the sacrament of confession, he did, however, encourage me and ask me to please promise to go home and to tell my mother that day. And he gave me the courage to talk to my mom about what was happening. And as I left that confessional, I'll never forget this because this is something that has stayed with me my entire life. I'm probably the only person that feels like they can skip to confession and out of confession. Is I walked out of that church, and being just like a 5th grader, I wasn't thinking about walking from a dark room to out where the sun was shining. But I opened the doors, and I remember being blinded by the lights as I opened the door, and I was like, oh, it's a miracle. I thought that God had washed me so clean from the stain of what had been happening to me that I had been given new eyes to see. And I remember standing there and watching the tree across the street and being able to feel like I saw multiple colors on the leaves dancing in the wind as the wind blew, and feeling more free than I had felt in such a long time. And I went home that day and I told my mom what was happening. And that's something that will always stay with me.